The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents The Bible and Rape. I've already talked about slavery. I've talked about slavery probably almost every week or every other week on the Atheist Experience. I've had numerous engagements on it. I put up a video for the Atheist Debates Project covering pretty much all my thoughts on slavery. It is one of my go-to arguments, not because I am trying to trick people, but because I think it is a real problem within the Bible. There are people who think the Bible is the good book. They cite verses talking about how it is useful for moral teaching. I don't find this to be the case. This video is not about slavery. It's about rape. And as such, if that subject is troublesome for you, by all means, you've been warned. But there are people who have emailed and said, hey, why do you keep talking about slavery all the time? Why don't you also talk about rape? I mean, after all, the Bible, threatens rape, gives instructions for rape, has specific laws surrounding rape that are incredibly problematic. Well, there's a reason that I haven't done it yet, and several reasons. One of them is that I just hadn't had enough time to really dig in to make sure that I was treating it fairly. So in this video, I'm going to go over the verses, some of the verses, surrounding the Bible's laws and other statements around the issue of rape. And I'm going to address both common atheist claims, which may in fact be incorrect, some common Christian apologetics attempting to defend what the Bible has to say about rape, and then talk about the best way to actually argue this case. So if you search around the internet to find out what objections people have raised to the Bible, you're going to find plenty of lists. Some of them are great. Some of them are lists of contradictions and troubling passages and absurdities and just offensive stuff. One of the best resources that I know of is skepticsannotatedbible.com. The problem is that these things are sort of crowdsourced, and you're not necessarily always getting something from an expert on ancient Hebrew or ancient cultures or the Bible. That's okay, because most of the people you're going to be talking to aren't experts either. But that doesn't mean that it's a good idea to go with bad arguments, because let's say you say, hey, look, in Deuteronomy 22 verses 23 and 24, it talks about if you rape somebody in the city, and here's the penalty for it. And they then go off and do research. If they find out that your assessment is inaccurate, and that there is a better interpretation, better explanation, and a successful apologetic that makes them realize that you were mistaken, that's doubly damning. It means that you convinced them of something, and then they went out and found out that you were wrong. So now you are untrustworthy, as are the people who share your same objections to this. So we'll take a look at what the apologists have to say, what the actual verses have to say, and what I think, as a non-expert who's spent a lot of time studying this, the best objections are, and what objections we should avoid. So if you take a look at the most common list, and I'll just start with what's at Skeptic Annotated Bible. If you go to what the Bible says about rape, it will list 3 passages, all from Deuteronomy 22. There's a 4th one there, which we'll get to later. But the 3 from Deuteronomy 22 are listed as city rape, country rape, and rape of an unbetrothed virgin. The problem is that not all these passages are addressing rape. And so when we list the first one as city rape, it's not necessarily talking about rape. Now, don't get me wrong, there are biblical scholars who will say that these passages are talking about rape, and there are others who aren't. And in some cases, you'll get into what the Hebrew word that is used in these passages means, and how each of these 3 passages uses a slightly different Hebrew word, for fines or seizes, or seizing being more of an assault type rape. So when we look at these passages, my goal is to be as accurate as possible, because they're still objectionable. The fact that I found a passage that somebody thought was about rape but isn't actually about rape doesn't mean that there's not something objectionable in the passage. And so if you start with Deuteronomy 22 verses 23 and 24, that's the one that gets labeled city rape. What it actually says, and I'm going to read it: if a damsel that is a virgin be betrothed unto a husband, and a man find her in the city and lie with her, then ye shall bring them both out unto the gates of the city, and ye shall stone them with stones that they die. The damsel, because she cried not, being in the city. What's being talked about here may or may not count as rape. The specific language of finding her, and this is a virgin who's betrothed to somebody. This passage may not be about rape at all. This could be somebody who's engaged, has sex with somebody else, or a woman who is a virgin and engaged, has sex with a man in the city. Then you kill them both, based on the presumption that she just didn't cry out. There would have been somebody to hear her if this was a real rape. And since nobody heard her, this was discovered after the fact, then clearly she didn't cry, and so she was complicit. And what we have here is a law against adultery, a law against fornication. She wasn't married, but she was betrothed to somebody. So I don't recommend using this passage as an example of a Bible passage about rape. But it's still awful. It is horrible. First of all, this idea that, it happened in the city and nobody heard her cry out, therefore she didn't cry out. That's already fallacious reasoning. Yes, I understand perhaps in ancient times the cities were quieter and perhaps somebody could have heard. But to presume that because nobody heard that she didn't cry out and therefore she deserves to die, I mean, if this was in fact a rape, now she's been punished twice, essentially. She's the victim of a sexual assault, and you're going to stone her to death because nobody heard her cry out. I understand in ancient times maybe they didn't have a good way to investigate this stuff. When we do, I'm going to do a series on the Bible and women, both stories of women and how the Bible views women. This is sort of the beginning of it, because when you go through the Bible and it talks about rape and sexual assault and things like this, all of these passages have to do with damsels. They have to do, in fact, with virgins, both betrothed and unbetrothed. Whether or not somebody's engaged, I'm not sure what the relevance is there. But what you find is that all these passages treat women as property. Their consent isn't a part of, isn't a concern. They are the father's property until he sells them off for the bride price. And there's several passages that we'll talk about today that really address this. But that first passage in Deuteronomy 22 isn't necessarily about rape. But if we move this situation into something we could understand, let's say your daughter or your sister has never had sex. I don't know why that's relevant, but we'll get into purity culture in another video. And she's engaged to someone. And it turns out that she runs off and has sex with someone else in town. We'll just keep it in town to make it simple. Maybe even to make it more like the ancient towns. We'll say we're out camping for the weekend, so everybody's in tents. So it's like a little village there with thin walls. And even though she's engaged to somebody else, she meets some guy and she has consensual sex with that guy while we're out camping. According to this passage, you're supposed to stone both of them to death. There are people, when you raise these objections, who will say, oh, well, that's the way it was back then. Okay, I'm not concerned about how it was. I'm concerned about what is right. Yes, but we have to explain things in terms, this is what ancient people understood. Well, we get back to something I've said before. How weak is your God? If your God can say don't eat shellfish and don't wear mixed fabrics, then certainly your God can say don't own people, and he can give reasonable punishments and concerns. Matter of fact, it might be the case that it would be good to say that this is not a crime at all, let alone something that two people deserve death for. But let's in fact say that you were still out camping. You've got the virgin who is engaged to someone, and she is in fact raped, sexually assaulted in the campground, but nobody actually hears her cry out. She would be stoned to death. That's what Deuteronomy 22, 23, and 24 calls for. The fact that it's not necessarily about rape does not mean that it is not wholly objectionable. It is one of the many immoral pronouncements in the Bible. If we continue reading and we read verses 25 through 27, this is where we get the phrase country rape. This doesn't happen in the city, it happens in the country. And it says, but if a man find a betrothed damsel, so we're back to an engaged virgin, in the field, and the man force her and lie with her, then the man only that lie with her shall die. For he found her in the field, and the betrothed damsel cried, and there was none to save her. So now we have the problems from the first one sort of amplified in the second one. Essentially, your betrothed virgin is out working in the field, and some guy comes along and forces her to have sex. The phrasing here is as harsh and as close to rape, and pretty much universally accepted as rape. Why? Why are the apologists nitpicking words from the previous passage and the one that follows this compared to this one? Because this is the only passage where the woman is seemingly exonerated, that she has no sin because she tried to cry out. There was nobody to save her. She didn't do anything wrong. All of this was done to her. And apart from issues about death penalty, which death is the penalty for virtually everything in the Bible, which we'll save for another time, this is overall pretty reasonable if, in fact, you had the facts. So you've got an engaged virgin out in the field, and some man comes upon and forces her to have sex, rapes her. He is subject to the death penalty. She is not. Now, setting aside the death penalty, at least we've got the blame right in that situation. But the problem here is that there's a presumption that she cried out. She's automatically someone who cried out but just was not heard because it took place in the field. I get that there's a presumption of innocence here, but that's not the only scenario that could occur out in the field, and you might wind up stoning to death an innocent man. Maybe not. The third passage in Deuteronomy that people point to is about an unbetrothed virgin, basically a young girl who is not promised to be the property of someone, not promised to be the wife of someone. And what it says in verses 28 and 29 is that if a man finds a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed, and I'm going to pause there for a second. What is this obsession with virginity? Why is it that all of these discussions about rape only focus on virgins? Purity culture is nonsense. Virginity is nonsense. It's largely a social construct, and there's parts of the Bible where you have to try to prove virginity, which actually happened earlier in this very chapter. And I promise you, when we go through all the issues surrounding how the Bible treats women, we will get to that, because it's weird and gross and archaic and really subject to confusion about bloody cloths and things like that. But if a man finds a damsel that's a virgin, which is not betrothed, and he lay hold on her, and he lie with her, and they be found, then the man that lie with her, oh, hang on a second, does this mean it's a rape? Does this mean that, or does it apply to consensual sex? Does this apply in the city? Does this apply in the field? It doesn't really say. The first two make a distinction that if there's a virgin who's engaged to somebody, hey, we have to consider, did this take place in town or did this take place out in the field? And if it's out in the field, it's okay. He dies, she lives. If it took place in town, you're going to kill them both because, having sex spoils you for everybody. It ruins your father's property. But if you're a virgin who isn't actually betrothed and somebody takes you and lays with you, we have no idea if this refers to consensual act or not, then the man that lays with her shall give the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he hath humbled her, he basically spoiled her, and he has to keep her forever. He can't ever divorce her. We've raised this issue before, and I've heard different apologists address it in different ways. First of all, if this was consensual sex, then obviously we're no longer talking about what the Bible has to say about rape, and now we're just talking about property laws. Hey, I had a daughter, she was a virgin, you slept with her, she wasn't engaged to anybody, so guess what? Now you are her husband and you can never divorce her. Well, I think the biggest issue here is pretty obvious. What if that's not what the girl wants? What if, in fact, this was a non-consensual act? What if she has no interest in being married? What if she has no interest in marrying him? What if he forced himself on her? If, in fact, she was the victim of a sexual assault and you are now essentially forcing her to marry her rapist, you have raised the cost and the price and the harm of what has happened to her exponentially. She now has to live with that individual forever. And I've had apologists say, hey, it does not say that she has to marry him. It says he has to marry her, and her father can refuse. And they're right. There's actually a passage in Exodus 22 that says pretty much the same thing. Basically, if you go to like Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy and read like chapters 21 through 23 of each of those, you find tons of stuff that are wrong in the Bible. So if you're ever floundering around and you're like, oh, I think it's in Deuteronomy somewhere, it's probably in Deuteronomy 22. It's probably in Exodus 21. It's probably in Exodus 22. It's along those lines. Exodus 22, I think it's verses 16 and 17, says essentially the same thing that Deuteronomy 22, 28, and 29 say. That if a man seduces a virgin who's not betrothed, he has to pay the bride price unless the father refuses to give her to him. In which case, he has to pay the money equal to the bride price, but he doesn't end up marrying her. So I've got a daughter, she's a virgin, she's not engaged, you have sex with her, according to Deuteronomy, you have to marry her unless I refuse as the father. Now, some people will spin this and say, oh yes, the father is clearly refusing on his daughter's behalf. What father of a daughter would ever force her to marry the man who sexually assaulted her? Well, I don't know. But I don't know that you can use that sort of apologetic. Because what quite often happens is we have to say, oh, we have to understand these things in terms of the time. They didn't have a good way to investigate these sorts of things. This is the way things were, that women were the property of their fathers and they were passed on, and this is how we merged nations and settled disputes and everything else. You don't get to then jump to a modern understanding of a healthy father-daughter relationship where he would not force his daughter to marry anybody that she didn't want to. When in fact, even in the modern world, women are sometimes forced by their fathers to marry people that they don't want to. They're forced by societal and cultural influence as well. So you don't get to be anachronistic in your apologetics about this verse and also claim that, oh, we have to consider it with respect to the sign of the times. If we're going to look at it from a modern perspective, which I think we should, because we now have a better understanding about what is and isn't moral than we did back then. It's not surprising that a bunch of wandering, goat-herding Jews would get these things wrong with respect to what we understand now. As I noted, they don't really have a good understanding of consent. The daughter's views are never really considered. What's considered is her value, and specifically her value as a wife, as property to her father to pass on to a husband. There's a lot more about rape in the Bible other than just what's right here in Deuteronomy facing us. So let's take a look at some of that. Keeping with this idea in the Bible of women as property, they were also considered the spoils of war. There's a number of different passages, and people have raised lots of objections, and apologists are like, hey, at no point does it say they were actual sex slaves. Well, that's actually not completely true. You have to think of things in kind of slightly broader terms. Let's start with, for example, Numbers 31, verses 15 through 18. Moses said unto them, have you saved all the women alive? Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that have known a man by lying with him. But all the women children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. Essentially, this is back to this idea about virginity, that virgins have value, almost as if they are mystical creatures to be prized. But Moses is basically saying, slaughter everybody and keep the young virgins for yourself. Now, first of all, how do we figure out who's a virgin and who's not? That's a little problematic, but pretty much they just save the young ones. What are they saving them for? Well, they're probably not saving them to work in the field as slaves, but even if they are, slavery is wrong. They would keep perhaps the young boys as well. Oh no, but boys would have to grow up to avenge their father. Well, if they're young enough, you don't even have to necessarily let them know what the story of what happened. It's not like, we have an internet for them to go, Google the history of their family. So it is reasonable to assume that what we're capturing here are concubines. Does it actually say that? No. It doesn't, in that particular verse, actually say that. but it's the most reasonable thing. And, oh, well, how do you know the concubines weren't consenting? Well, because they were captured as prisoners of war, and that sort of coercion overrides the idea of consent. Maybe later on, hey, they might come to love their captors, but we also know that this is a psychological condition that we should prevent against. The very idea that you would instruct people to kill everybody but keep the young girls for yourself is bizarre. Not just bizarre, it's immoral. In Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14, when you go out to war against the enemies, and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands, so that you take captives. If you see a comely woman among the captives and become so enamored of her that you wish to have her as a wife, you may take her home to your house. Hey, she's hot. We just slaughtered everybody in her family. She's going to be my wife. Her opinion of this is irrelevant. She's property. But before she lives there, she must shave her head and pare her nails and lay aside her captive's garb. This is a pretty clear description. This isn't, oh my goodness, I fell in love with a woman who was part of the enemy camp and now I wish her to be my wife. It is, she's hot. I'm going to make her not attractive. I'm going to make her shave her head. Not that there's anything wrong with shaved head, but I'm talking about this as a sense of putting her in a submissive role, trim her nails so that she can't attack or anything else, make her remove the clothing from her house. Basically, this is describing the sort of conditioning of a sex slave. This is in the Bible. Many times I've asked people, you think the Bible is the good book? Would you let me read passages of my choosing to your children? Nobody's ever taken me up on that, and that's a good thing. It's actually probably not too dangerous for them because I respect their children enough not to read them these things unless they're of an age where I can read it to them, explain what's wrong with it with reasonable confidence that they are going to reject this immoral garbage that exists in a book that people say is the good book. So after you shave her head and everything else, you allow her to mourn her father and her mother for a month. And then you get to have sex with her. It says you may have relations with her, and you shall be her husband and she shall be your wife. However, if later on you lose your liking for her, you have to let her go. Hang on a second. We're talking about marriage and marriage values. Christians are generally opposed to divorce. And for years, the people portrayed the Bible as being opposed to divorce. This shows that not only are women at a completely different tier, with respect to rights and value. But a woman that you capture and turn into your sex slave is at an even lower tier, which is how we end up with traditional marriage in the Bible being a man, his wife, and his concubines, and his sex slaves that he's captured from war. So you have to let her go if she wishes it, but you shall not sell or enslave her since she was married to you under compulsion. I don't know how much more clear you can get. Deuteronomy 21, 10 through 14, go and read it. She was married to you under compulsion. It was a forced marriage. You don't get to re-enslave her. Oh, how nice of the God of the Jews, the God of the Israelites, to say, hey, when you're done with your sex slave, you should probably be nice to her and let her go because she didn't really consent to any of this. It's not the only time we talk about sex slaves in the Bible as part of conquering. Judges chapter 5, verse 30. They must be dividing the spoils they took. There must be a damsel or two for each man. So now, this is just the way things were. And so when apologists start talking to you about having to consider things within the bounds of ancient history, oh, this is the way things were. Slavery was just a thing. Going out and slaughtering entire villages and towns was just a thing. Keeping the young virgins as your sex slaves was just a thing. That doesn't change whether or not any of it's moral. It's all immoral. These would all be recognized as war crimes in any modern court. These would all be listed as repugnant. Every Christian on the planet and every Jew on the planet should object if anything like this were to happen to anyone. And I'm confident that most of them would object if something like this happened to their family. And the very idea that you could conquer somebody, take their family as sex slaves, and then expect people to make excuses for it because, oh, this is what our Bible says. This is what our holy book says is an okay thing to do. When people ask why I don't deal with the rape issue enough, I don't have a good enough answer. You'll probably hear me talk about this quite a bit more. I may substitute it in place of slavery for quite some time because there's big issues here. But it, believe it or not, may in fact get a little worse. When people cite the Bible as a moral authority, this is something inspired by God that is to teach us how to behave, and then you find verses like this that are all about taking sex slaves and, hey, we're going to have some concern about whether or not a virgin has sex with somebody and whether or not she's engaged and whether or not it took place in town or in city. It's not always about rape. And so I would caution the atheists who are raising these objections to be very careful about what they label rape and what they label not rape. Certainly, I would say that there can be no objection to the idea that taking sex slaves is rape. Oh, you make her your wife. Congratulations. The people who have captured women and locked them up in their basement for 10, 15 years may view them as their wife as well. But that's not a holy matrimony. Oh, wait, so now you're saying your God sanctions a holy matrimony between an Israelite and the individual woman that he captures and enslaves, and it's holy right up until he lets her go? The Bible's view on marriage, sex, rape, and divorce is repugnant. That is the thing to address, not merely, hey, the Bible has this passage that seems to sanction rape. It is awful, and it gets worse than that. Because what would you say if there was an individual who threatened rape, that said, if you don't do these sorts of things, I'm going to make sure that somebody comes along and rapes you, or rapes your wife, or I'm going to take your wife from you and give it to somebody else? We would view that individual as a moral monster. And yet this is exactly how the God in the Old Testament is portrayed. If you go look at 2 Samuel chapter 12, God basically comes down and tells David, I will bring evil upon you out of your own house. Basically, what's described there is, because you have failed me, because you have sinned against me, I'm going to give your wives to other people, and the children born of all this are going to die, etc. But there's also a passage in Zechariah that is talking about the future, talking about the sorts of wars and calamities that are going to befall the Israelites. And in it, basically God says, I'm going to arrange for all of these other people to come and war with you. I'm going to make it so that you are accosted and mauled, that your cities will be razed, and your women will be raped. And then I'm going to go out and fight and beat them. One day, the true house of Israel will be victorious. The way religions poison minds is of great interest, and I pity people like myself who fell prey to this sort of apologetic tap dance that makes excuses for things which any reasonable person would immediately recognize as morally repugnant. We have here a God that loves to show off. When the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt, he goes around creating plagues. And at several different points, Pharaoh's ready to give up, saying, okay, I'm going to let your people go. But instead, God hardens his heart because he's not done showing off. And similarly in Zechariah, what we got here is, okay, you guys haven't been paying attention to me. The house of Israel has fallen into shambles. There's some of you who are decent, some of you are not. And so I'm going to arrange for everybody to come fight you, to destroy your villages, and I'm going to have them rape your women. And then I'm going to go out and fight them and put together, and we'll get the remains, the good remains of the house of Israel. There are people who look at that and say, isn't this wonderful? Because God is telling us what's about to happen so we can prepare ourselves. And God will avenge those of us who are righteous. What it does is it essentially puts the individuals who are raped in the category of, these are the bad Israelites who deserve this. These are the people who have not strengthened their relationship with Yahweh. These people who have not lived according to the law. And so they deserve this because God is almighty and all righteous. And if he wants someone to come around and rape our women, he gets to do that. But the phrasing is problematic too. I mean, this is one of those things where, yes, this is the way we spoke and thought back then, but our women, your women, I'm going to have some of your women. It's all about property. And so they're chattel. And so it's easy to dismiss this, this notion that, oh, well, God's not actually sanctioning rape. If God has put together a plan by which he will have people come in and rape the women of your community, and there is a God who's actually doing this, then he is a moral monster. It's hard to find monsters more monstrous than this individual. And yet, oh, well, isn't it wonderful? You know, he's warning us, he's given us fair warning, and these people, this is what they deserve. Nobody deserves this. There are countless passages, well, all right, not countless. There are countable passages in the Bible. There are a lot of them that deal with these sorts of situations because you had the ancient Hebrews were running around just slaughtering everybody because they thought that's what their God wanted them to do. I don't believe there's a God. I don't believe that the Bible is a good book. I don't believe it's morally instructive, except for showing the sorts of things that we should not do. Oh, hang on a minute, Matt. There's good passages in the Bible. Yes, there are. You know what? I've said some good things and I've said some bad things. But the good things I say don't make up for the bad things. They don't exonerate them. We don't get to just ignore them. I've done things in my life that I wish I hadn't done, that I definitely shouldn't have done. I have acted it immorally. And what makes me value humanism is that it encourages me to recognize those instances, make amends, and do the thing that Christians would say, which is repent, to turn away, to say, I'm not going to be like this anymore. I don't know how you can turn away from the very thing that your good book is sanctioning. The idea that we need to be concerned about virginity, and we should be concerned about whether or not a virgin has sex in the city or the country, and then we should kill people over this. Your daughter, your 16-year-old daughter who's not engaged to anybody, goes out and has sex and gets pregnant. You going to kill her? You going to kill the boy? You might want to kill the boy who knocked her up. That's another poisonous problem with our culture, is that we go on this reactive sort of bent of not justice, but vengeance. And if that's the case, then maybe they should look up the passage that says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, to discourage vengeance. The problem is that there are other passages that encourage the sort of acts that we're talking about, that make it seem that it's okay, in the case of slavery, to own people. And it's hard to get away from this idea of owning people if you think you own your women, if women are property. But here's something that we haven't really discussed at all in this video. What about men who are raped? What about situations that the Bible doesn't describe? There's not even a hint of a thought that those sorts of things are or could be real. Clinging to an ancient book that is demonstrably immoral and pretending that it's going to guide you well is one of the gravest errors that you can make. In part because I'm convinced that you already know better. You are better than the God you believe in. You are better than the book that you believe in. You are better than that because you wouldn't do the things that the book advocates. You wouldn't take sex slaves. You wouldn't kill your daughter for having sex. You probably wouldn't kill the boy who had sex with her. You would not ignore the fact that your son may also be the victim of sexual assault. I once told a group of Church of Christ preachers that I could write a better book than the Bible, and to prove it, I could rewrite the Bible word for word and change its position on slavery, and it would by definition be a better book. That's also true if we rewrote the Bible word for word and changed its position on rape, changed its position on purity and virginity, changed its position on women as property. The book that people will continually refer to as the good book isn't good at all. And it's not just slavery and rape, there's genocide and horrible views on social justice, on where people fit in society. It's time for us all to make sure that we are forthright, honest, and as accurate as possible in denouncing what this book has to say. And if somebody says, oh, but that's the Old Testament, well, I've already covered that in a video as well, because the other things in the Old Testament are original sin and the Ten Commandments. And now they're just picking and choosing. And if you're going to pick and choose, then I suggest that you pick humanism, that you choose humanism, that you choose to live a life that is founded on good reasoning, where we have taken the failings of those people who came before us and improved our understanding of how best to get along, what rights people should have, and what morality truly is. Because to just say, the Bible says it, God says it, therefore it's okay, means you are now okay with slavery and rape.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.